Hi, everyone. Welcome to the California Coastal Resilience Network webinar series. My name is Alexis Barrera, and I'm standing in as facilitator for today's webinar as the Coastal Restoration Sea Grant Fellow for the State Coastal Conservancy. I also have with me here our North Coast intern here at the State Coastal Conservancy.
Hi, this is Triana Anderson, just helping out, facilitating.
Yeah, so she's going to be helping me out with questions, and I'll explain that in a little bit. The California Coastal Resilience Network promotes knowledge exchange through monthly webinars on climate-induced impacts on human communities and coastal habitats. We'll provide a link to the network if you'd like to join, or you can even watch our past webinars. Today, we're hosting members of NOAA's Office for Coastal Management for demos on resilience-related tools available on the Digital Coast platform. First, you'll hear from David Bettenbaugh, a coastal science specialist for OCM, who will present the Coastal Flood Exposure Mapper. Then, Mark Finkbeiner, a physical scientist, will demo the OceanReports tool. Lastly, Billy Brooks, the geospatial analyst for OCM, will present the Adapting Stormwater Management for Coastal Floods resource. As a reminder for how the GoToWebinar interface works, if you have a question, you can navigate to the questions box and type it in at any point throughout the talk, or when we ask you for them. I will read your questions aloud, our speakers will respond, and you are welcome to follow up with more questions as they come up. We will follow up after the webinar with a recording and slides from today. With that, let's begin. I will hand it over to, I believe David is starting off first.
Yes, that is correct. Thank you so much. And this is David Bettenbaugh, and I'm a geospatial analyst here at NOAA's Office for Coastal Management in Charleston, South Carolina, and I will take you on a brief live demonstration of our Coastal Flood Exposure Mapper. And we're going to start here on the Digital Coast page, and this is where we house our data, tools, trainings, and other resources, and also those resources of our partners. First of all, a quick sound check. Can everybody hear me okay?
I can hear you, David.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, if anyone's having trouble hearing, you can just type that into the questions, and we'll be monitoring that box throughout the presentation as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. And so you'll notice in our top 5 list here, we have the Flood Exposure Mapper. That's how we will get started diving into the tool. That'll take us to what we call our tools page, or our product page for this particular resource. And here you'll notice that there's a bit of an overview to give you a little bit of information about the tool, including a quick summary of the geographic extent of this tool. And you'll see that it includes the East Coast, the West Coast, the Gulf of Mexico, the Pacific, and the Caribbean. The newest addition is the West Coast, which we expanded our data and maps to cover the West Coast in early 2019. Scrolling down a little bit further, you'll notice that we have a video embedded here, and this is a quick orientation to the tool and how to make maps. This is relatively new, and it's just under 3 minutes, so it's just an even more abbreviated version of the quick demo that we're going to have today. And then at the very bottom of the page, you'll find some other related resources. So from this page, we can launch right into the tool, and this will take us to our splash page. And I like to highlight this statement here because it really explains the purpose of the tool. Help start your community discussions about hazard impacts with maps of your area that show people, places, and natural resources exposed to coastal flooding. Even more simply, it's just maps to help start discussions about flood hazards. From there, we'll click the Get Started button, and this will take us to our active map window. Before we start looking at data and making maps, I'm going to take you on a 4 corners tour of this tool. So we'll start in the upper left-hand corner, and clicking on the NOAA emblem, it'll give you links to some of the pages that we've seen thus far if you ever need to backtrack. Then we'll go over here to the far upper right-hand corner. This is our geographic search bar, and so you can type in an address or a city, a county, and it'll zoom to your area of interest. So and today we're going to go to Huntington Beach for our demonstration. So you can see it does autofill, and we'll click on our area of interest, our title of interest, and it zooms right in, and you can see that you can zoom in and out as you wish. From there, we'll go to the bottom right-hand corner and click on this question mark icon, and this takes us to our About page, where it gives you a little bit more information about the tool, a disclaimer, and then more importantly, it has links to additional resources. We have links to the frequently asked questions. We have links to a data sources document, which gives a description of all of the source data and links to authoritative sources. And also wanted to point out that we have a page that gives some tips on using these maps to help people get started with initiating those discussions with these maps. Just beneath that, we have this icon for Share Map. We consider this the quick share, and you'll notice that provides a shortened URL. I'm actually going to copy it and demonstrate real quick how this works. And it actually recreates the map in the exact state in which you shared it. So this is exactly what we're looking at, but this was generated from that shared URL. And then, of course, you have your standard zoom buttons. And then the base map, you'll see that our default is this street-based map, but we also have two other options available, one of which is a dark canvas, which is really great at accentuating the data that's in the frame. We also have some satellite imagery as a base map. And finally, you'll notice this roads, I don't know if you can make it out initially as a road, but that's what it represents. And so you can click upon that toggle, and it'll turn on and off that roads reference layer, which really helps to provide some orientation in your location. And finally, in this corner, we have the legend, which helps you understand the data that are in the map. So we'll leave that open, and we'll go all the way over to the far left-hand corner, and we'll click on this icon. This will open up the layer control panel. And you'll notice that within here, we have a list of all of the layers that are available. First, we're just going to talk about, I'm going to show you all the buttons and the functions before we start talking about the layers and start making maps. So there's a very simple toggle button for turning on and off your layers of interest. Also, for each layer, you'll notice that there's this info icon. If you click upon that, it'll open up an info panel, which will give a brief description about data that are in the map and oftentimes why it may matter, why it's important in the context of considering your hazard exposures. And so I just clicked on the info panel for the high tide flooding, and you'll notice that in this one we actually have an embedded video. And so that is actually the case for a couple of the hazards here, where we have short videos that just provide a little educational context about the particular hazard. I believe we have that for tsunami as well as for the storm surge. Yeah, there it is. And then we also have an icon for opacity control. And so you click upon that, and the slider opens up, and you can control the opacity of the layer that you're looking at. Finally, down here at the bottom, we have a Save Map button. So if you click on this button, it'll save the map just as you have it framed, and then it will populate your Saved Map section here. Now, currently, sadly, we do not have any saved maps, but throughout this demonstration, we will make some maps, and we'll see what it looks like and what options are available once you have some saved maps. Okay, so now let's start talking about the layers. Here in the hazard layers, we have what the default, which is the Coastal Flood Hazard Composite. And this is actually the one data set that we build specifically for this tool. And that involves combining layers from all of the other hazard data sets. So if you open up the info panel, it'll give you a brief rundown of the zones that are included in that particular data set. And you can see that in this particular layer, the darker the color, the more it gets to a deep red, the more layers you have that intersect an area. And also unique to this layer, you can click upon it, and it will give you a quick query response, tell you the number of hazard zones that intersect that point, and a quick list of those hazard zones. So moving down through our other hazard layers, we have high tide flooding, the FEMA flood zones, and tsunami run-up zones. And you'll notice that each of those are just associated with a single layer, whereas if you get into storm surge, they're not currently mapped for the West Coast, so there are no data here. We just have this hashed out area, but you'll notice that a slider does pop up. And so if we look at the sea level rise layers, you'll also see that same slider. and you can adjust that up to 10 feet. And these are pulling in layers from our sea level rise viewer. So we're just leveraging layers that we've already put out there, map services that we've already put out there for another one of our wonderful tools. And then you can explore these different hazard layers individually, but you can also use them as overlays on top of these other thematic layers that are shown below. And so for the interest of time, I'm not going to read off each one that's available, but we do have layers for societal exposure, including some vulnerability layers, population density as well. We have some layers representing the infrastructure and layers for the ecosystem. So with that quick orientation, we're going to start making some maps. So let's say, for example, we're just interested in creating a simple map of the flood hazard composite. It just creates a bit of a heat map, if you will, of your hazard profile. And we'll adjust the opacity a little bit and save this map. You'll notice that we now have one map saved. Now, let's say, for example, we're interested in looking at tsunami zones. And just curious, maybe if there are some critical facilities that intersect those hazard zones. Well, look, sure enough, there are in this area here. Might zoom in a little bit and figure that might be something of interest to others and we want to share it. So we'll save this map as well. And let's see, while we're looking at tsunami, let's go scroll down and look in ecosystem. And we have a layer here for potential pollution sources. Click on that, and you'll notice over here that these are include brownfields, hazardous waste facilities, toxic chemical storage and generation sites. So these are areas that you can consider as potential secondary risks or cascading risks that can happen if any of these sites are potentially impacted by a significant flooding event. So we can see some of those also intersect the tsunami zone that might be of interest, so we'll save that map as well. Now going back up, I meant to show this earlier, but we'll go back up and we'll look at one of the societal exposure layers. Let's see, we'll turn off tsunami, and let's take a look at the poverty layer here. So this is mapping census block groups, and you can see that the hue is getting darker and deeper purple based upon the percentage of the population of that block group that lives below the poverty line. And let's see, interested to see if any of those high poverty block groups intersect the FEMA flood zone. Okay, so sometimes you have to turn the layers on and off or draw down the opacity a little bit. We can see through here that we have some of these darker block groups that are intersecting. We can see that this medium orange here is our 1% annual chance for A zones, and the lighter orange is our 0.2% or 500-year zones. Okay, and so we can see that there's some incidents of higher poverty occurrence in those zones. So we're going to save a map of that as well. So maybe we'll draw it down a little bit. I draw down the opacity a little bit and save a map. And also what I like to do on these is create just a version with the hazard overlay and without, so that you can actually possibly do a side-by-side comparison of the images. Okay, so we have gone through and saved the suite of maps. So let's get into the Save Maps section, and we'll talk about that a little bit. You can see that as I draw down and scroll through here that we have all of our maps saved here, all the ones that we've looked at and saved thus far. Beneath each map, there are a selection of icons. This first one is for exporting the map. You can export the map just as a straight image of the map as a JPEG file, or you can export it with the title burned in, which would be the combination of layers that you've used in that map. Or you can export just the legend standalone. Say, for example, you create the same map, same combination of layers, but different locations. You only need the legend once. Also, we have the quick save URLs. It works exactly the same as what I demonstrated earlier. You also can add a custom description if you need to distinguish the maps from one another. Maybe you've created, again, the same map but in different locations. And finally, we have this trash can, so if you want to throw away a particular map, you can do so. And finally, wanted to point out at the bottom here for Share the Collection, this is a way that you can get all of the maps that you've created out at the same time. You have two options. You can click the Copy All button, and that'll copy that to your clipboard, and you can paste that into a document or an email. Or you can click on the Download as Text, and that will download all of the titles and the quick URLs, though it will not include the images. Do want to point out that when you hit Copy All, it just saves the images in a much larger size than you actually see here. It's a very good size JPEG. And then finally, I wanted to just make the point that all of these images that are these maps that you save are preserved in your browser memory. So that means that when you come back to the site, that they will be there for you, as long as two things are true. As long as, one, you're on the same computer, and two, you have not cleared your cache. So they do persist in your browser over time. And with that, that will conclude my quick tour, and I'm just going to take us back out to the Digital Coast site, and I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Mark for the next part of our demonstration tour.
All right, thank you, Dave. Can anybody hear me okay? I'll take silence as consent. All right, so I work in the Science and Geospatial Division with Dave and with Billy, and my focus really is on marine planning. And what I'll talk to you guys about today is a tool we released back last spring called OceanReports. It is available on Digital Coast, but I prefer to invoke it through Marine Cadastre, and the reason is that this tool sort of complements and is intended to complement the data viewing and some of the ocean planning background information that's present on Marine Cadastre. So we'll invoke it from here, and it's right up on the front page. We're hosting it pretty prominently these days. So here's the splash page, and as you open up the tool, you'll see that you really have two paths forward as you continue your analysis. We have a view the quick reports. These are pre-calculated geographies that we felt would be of common interest. They include things like state and federal waters, protected areas, national marine sanctuaries, national estuarine reserve sites. But the real power of the tool is over here in this draw custom area. So let's go into that. We do have to provide a disclaimer here. This tool is presenting summary information, and we see it in terms of its role as an initial screening tool that would give you an early indication of whether a particular area has potentially conflicting ocean uses or habitats of concern or areas of high vessel traffic that might dissuade you or encourage you from proposing some activity in that geography. And then having come to that decision, you're still required and encouraged to do a more formal, typical spatial analysis, and then work with any kind of permitting agencies to go through the formal process. So this isn't the final answer for whether an area is suitable. It's really just an early indicator that things look good or don't look good. So we've had to capture that kind of language here in this little disclaimer. Following Dave's lead in terms of the four-corner tour, I kind of like that. Up here you have your draw functionality. So let's zoom in. Let's go to the West Coast and draw a box. And what this has just done in the last couple of seconds is query over 100 data sets in the background to produce these summary statistics. We have these statistics organized into these themes over here on the left. So the first one we're in is general information. This is just a lay of the land in terms of the area. We can scroll down and see the prevailing bathymetries and elevations, populated places, what the jurisdictions are. We've got a little piece of California waters in this box, apparently. And then political jurisdictions that might be relevant if you were going to pursue a permitting process. Federal statutes that are relevant are also included. This is just an example of how each of these infographics has been designed. We put a lot of thought into what kind of pertinent information was most important to convey in these summary infographics. And it takes various flavors. I'll show you some of that as we go forward. Just want to give you a little bit of navigation here as you look at any individual one. So we have a little bit of collapsible functionality here to open up these as a list. Right here, you will see what we call the rule. So we had, for each of these infographics, had to make a decision as a team as to whether we were going to report things that were nearby, things that were within, or what the percentage was. And that rule varies according to each infographic, and it's very important for you to understand what that rule is as you take these numbers and then want to apply them. Up here in the upper right, well, let's see, let's get something with something more interesting in terms of a legend. Let's see. We can do this one, I guess. So, and it's, well, actually, that's not particularly interesting. But we do have a legend for anything that you might be able to display in the map, and you do that through this little tool here. Let's go. Let's do this. Again, this is a similar toggle functionality to what Dave showed us before. We can turn these layers on. Zoom out a little bit, see how that looks. Coastal counties, this is taking a little while to draw. And of course, sometimes you want to turn them off. As you look at this map, here are some of the tools that are available here. This is a zoom out to show the regions by which we've organized this. Here, we have the chance to input a set of corner coordinates. We felt like this would be helpful if people were taking coordinates out of the federal CFR for an area that might be under consideration for some proposed use. We can return to where we were before. Let's cancel this, get that out of the way. We have the ability to search as Dave did. We can measure if we need to know distances offshore. And we've got a couple of different units there. And then we have a variety of base maps that you might want to bring up. This defaults to the ocean data, ocean base map from Esri, actually. But sometimes that's not what you want. You can bring up the imagery as well. We'll go ahead and turn these off because I think they're a little distracting now. Yeah. And we have the ability to turn on occasionally the raster nautical charts. There's a lot of information on these charts that's just good from a spatial context. So we thought that would be helpful as an additional thing to have in your view. And that's sort of how you navigate through this map. One thing you may notice, and especially you'll see this if you go to, let's go back to turn that off, and go back to our ocean, is if you bring up any of the existing areas, you may notice a generalized boundary. And that is really just a function of something that draws quickly in your map view. I want to reassure you that if you were to bring up a NEAR site and run statistics for that, that is querying the native high-resolution, highly detailed boundary of those sites. So don't be concerned that maybe the statistics might be misleading in that sense. So I'll just walk you through a couple of these themes and show you some of the ways that we've expressed this information in terms of creative infographics. So for energy and minerals, let's go to offshore wind resource potential. We wanted to show information here that would put it in the context for a general user from the public. And we can turn this on. We recognize that, you know, an average of what the percentage of suitable wind resource potentials is might be an overgeneralization of what's really going on in that box. And that's why we have, in many cases, the ability to turn this layer on. And then you can see, oh, really the favorable geography here is actually up here in this northeast or northwest corner. So that's sometimes helpful information to include. If we go to natural resources and conservation, let's go down to the Audubon birds. Go. In this case, we are routing you off-site. There are a couple of these infographics where we are referencing data that is actually well presented in a different website. And so in some instances, the tool will actually take you off there to go further. But let's cancel that. We do have the sites that are specific, and we did want to include that. So you'll see a few cases where we actually take you off the tool site. The most interesting thing that we've recently added is oceanographic and biophysical data. And that is pulling from modeled data in most cases. This is typically coming from NASA or from other NOAA sources. And let's look at current speed and direction. Oops, don't want to get confused here. Go back. Okay. Turn that later on. And then down here, we're using a compass rose to convey this information. So what you're seeing here is the prevailing direction. You have the portion of that current coming from that direction that falls into these different current speed categories. And then down here in these box and whisker charts, you have the mean and max and minimum current velocity. So a couple ways to present the information. This was something we thought long and hard about. And then as you zoom into this on the map, you'll see that these are actually just arrows showing the direction, and there's some intensity information along with that color too. Vessel traffic is something we're going to focus on here inside the transportation and infrastructure theme. Let's go ahead and turn that on. Turn all that. So this is AIS data. There's typically a lag in our AIS data. AIS is the automatic identification system that the Coast Guard monitors for vessels that are over, I think 60 feet is the threshold at this point. So what we have here is an annual composite of vessel traffic, and basically this turns out to be one of the really important data sets in terms of understanding whether you have ocean use conflicts. And there are people that are starting to look at it in terms of noise impacts to marine mammals too. And then finally, we have an economics page, and this just shows here. This is drawing from the ENOW data, the Economics National Ocean Watch data, and it is basically presenting how much of the economy is devoted to these different sectors. And there's other infographics here as well. You do have some mouse over capability with some of these infographics additionally. All right, so let's zoom out. We've drawn our box. We may decide, ooh, that's really not, that's kind of in the way of all this traffic coming into San Francisco Bay. What if we looked at an area down here? We have the ability to basically drag and drop the box, and this is a little bit of a tool you might want to use if you wanted to see if something was a little more favorable. Maybe if I just moved it a mile offshore, things get a lot better for whatever I'm proposing to do. All right, so finally, let's say this is good. We're happy with what we're seeing here. The next step is to come up here, and we have that same share functionality that David demonstrated with the previous tool. We also understand that people are likely to have questions about the source data behind these infographics. That is one thing they are always very concerned with. So we've grouped the metadata for all these different themes on the left, and you can, let's put here, just ocean disposal sites. So this is going to take you to the actual FGDC metadata, where you can really understand the source of what these statistics are giving you. And finally, typically we want to print. So this tool was not intended to really replace typical GIS analysis, but it really was targeting folks that aren't spatial analysts and giving them a quick, easily understood assessment of what's going on in their area. So right now we have this full report type. We can sort the material in this, what eventually will become a PDF, by these different issue areas. We thought that this would really be a quick way to filter. Turns out any particular data set is probably going to be relevant to all of these. So right now the report will contain 68 infographics. If we go to renewable energy, well, we've cut 20 off. That's probably a lot. But then in this tool, we can be specific. We can take individual data and infographics out that we aren't concerned with. All right, I don't need that. Okay, now we're down to 47. 46. We wanted to make this not a multi-page thick PDF and really have it be streamlined. And then finally, this is your option. You have a PDF output. And you could share the link as we did with the other tools. But this is a hard copy, and the idea was that this could be someone you could hand to a policymaker. So I think that covers all the functionality of the tool. Where we're going with it is to explore whether we can set criteria in these infographic boxes and then have the tool draw the box, sort of reverse engineering the process. So that's a pretty formidable effort. I don't think that's going to happen in the next year or two, but that's kind of what we're looking at. And at that, I think I'll hand it over to Billy and not take up any more time.
All right, thanks, Mark and David. So my name is Billy Brooks, and I'm a geospatial analyst here at the Office for Coastal Management. And I'm going to be talking about we don't call it a tool, actually. We call it a self-guided training, and it is our. So if you go to our training page off the Digital Coast and search for stormwater, you will see our Adapting Stormwater Management for Coastal Floods self-guided resource. So clicking that link will take you to this Digital Coast intro page. And this is a website or a training that was developed for stormwater management, the floodplain management, land use planning communities primarily, to look at how do coastal flooding, the different types of coastal flooding, both now and potentially in the future, how will it potentially impact our current and future stormwater infrastructure? And so similar to the other resources in the Digital Coast, here's some pertinent information that goes with the site. But as you launch the site, this is more of a traditional website. It's not a tool in the sense that you have a mapping viewer and different controls that change the map and you can pan in and out. This is mostly information within the context of adapting your stormwater management or infrastructure for coastal floods. The site is divided up into 4 sections. The first is the Understand section, where we talk about provide information on the different types of coastal flooding. Then there's the Assess section, which gives you kind of a big general overview of what are water levels doing in my area and what might they be doing in the future. And then based on that overview information, you can go into the Analyze section, where we provide a methodology for the stormwater management community, engineering departments. We provide a methodology to incorporate the coastal flooding and potential future coastal flooding into an engineering level analysis on your stormwater infrastructure. And then once you've done that, we provide information on what do I do about it? How do I take action? And you'll notice this My Stormwater Report part of the tool. This is a place basically to capture information that you want to preserve and keep and things you've learned as you've gone through the site. And in the end, you can print a report as you add information to this stormwater report. So in the first section, in the Understand section, we provide basically definitions of different types of coastal flooding, but we talk about what contributes to coastal flooding. And again, if you're a stormwater engineer, you're in the land use planning community, you might have the need to educate the public or educate coworkers or local elected officials on the different types of coastal flooding that might even pose a threat or a risk to your area. And we have this infographic. Let's see if I can zoom back out. Okay. So as you go through, you can see that this is just, the water is going up and down. It's somewhat dynamic and interactive. Well, what's the regional oceanographic effects? What do they do to water levels? Well, they can increase water levels based on seasons, based on decadal cycles. There are lots of things that go into regional oceanographic effects. Well, we also know we have high tides and then we have king tides. Well, those contribute to increased water levels. And you can see in this case, if you don't have a backflow preventer on this outlet, if the water is high enough, you're going to end up with water on streets and roads affecting things. Well, what happens if the rain starts falling while we have a king tide? Well, you'll see that if water can't get out, then it's just going to increase the amount of water filling up this bathtub, and it increases the impacts. Well, let's put wind waves on top of that, and while we're at it, let's throw in a storm coming. So really you can see the different potential impacts of these different flooding types. And one thing to note too is that we have a sea level rise toggle, and the reason it's not a separate thing that just gets added is that it affects everything. So you'll see that the sea level rise, it adjusts the base, so it increases the base that everything else is happening on top of. So you can see the different impacts of sea level rise. So this is a great graphic to use maybe in a public setting or at a committee meeting, just to show the different components that go into coastal flooding. As you scroll through this page, you can hover over the different terms to see, well, what does this term mean? Kind of like a dictionary. So we cover a variety of inundation types. And then you'll see this prompt to document what you've learned and to add it to your report. And then there's the question, what do you already know about flooding in your area? Well, I know that we deal with relative sea level rise, and that involves a variety of factors. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to put it into this little section and add it to my report. And so you'll see that your report then, for this section, you have some information associated with this question. And you can kind of manage your report in certain ways. So as we go through, now we're talking about what are the impacts of the coastal flooding we just learned about on stormwater infrastructure. So there's a lot of information. There's no way I can cover all of it. What are the impacts to the community? A call to action. What are different considerations for these different communities and these different planning departments or local agencies? What do we do about coastal inundation? And here again, you can document what you've learned or information you might want to use later on. You can put that into this area. You can add it to your report. All right, so now that you've learned about all these different types of inundation, then really, how high does the water need to get in my area before I have a problem? And when do I think that problem is going to happen? So that's where we have you go to the assess section. And this is the part of the site that's kind of like a tool. We call it our quick flood assessment tool. And what this does is this automates what used to be a very time-consuming task that somebody would have to do, visit a variety of websites, download a handful of spreadsheets, find your location, and then summarize a bunch of numbers. Well, we've tried to do that for you. And it just requires a few inputs, but what you're going to get is information both on current inundation, current flooding, but also how might future flooding be impacted by different sea level rise scenarios. So as we start a new assessment, the first step is selecting your state or territory. You can see that it zooms in, and so we have information for each of these locations. I'm going to choose the Oakland or Alameda tide gauge, but let's say you were up in Northern California, you would actually have to pick a location that was closest to you. And this is based on NOAA tide gauge locations, because that's where a lot of water level information and data are captured. So we're currently in phase 2, and we're trying to fill in the gaps. So if you're in Eureka, you've got to choose between this location and this one, and it's not ideal right now, but we're working on that. So for this demo, I'm going to choose the Alameda location, which is basically Oakland. So I've chosen my location. Next, I need to go set a threshold. And the threshold we're setting is a coastal flood threshold. So this is a water level where things start to happen. Bad things start to happen. We start to really feel the impacts. And the data that you now see on the map over here is our sea level rise information. And really, these are just water levels above mean high or high water. So as you raise the water level up, not so much is happening at 1 or 2 feet, but let's say at 3 feet, we really start to see some impacts in this area. So we're going to go ahead, and it automatically sets my threshold to 3 feet. So that's a water level where we think we're going to have problems. You could enter in any water level here, and the report will still work. So if you have an already predefined threshold and you know that number, you can enter that in this location. Next, we're going to set a tolerance, and this tolerance or threshold really is the number of days of high tide or king tide flooding that are a problem. So let's say 2 days a month, that's when all right, there we go. That's when it's too much for us to handle. And then we create this report. And really what happened is we took those 3 inputs and then compiled a lot of information based on water levels. So we talked about just what is that, your threshold, here's some context on it. Return periods for different water levels are going to change over time. So we talked about how much water or sea level rise increase is it going to take to make your current threshold into a 2-year event, or a 50% chance each year. We talk about when does the threshold you entered, when does that become just normal mean high or high water under different sea level rise scenarios. So you can see the years in which the 3-foot threshold becomes mean high or high water, which means you're going to see it pretty much every high tide. We talk about when high tide or king tide flooding becomes a problem. So 24 days, that's too much for us. When might we see high tide flooding 24 days a year under these different sea level rise scenarios? When will the 1% annual chance water level, or that's the 100-year or 1% annual chance water level, when will it become the 10% chance or the 10-year water level? So occurring once every 10 years now. In some cases, under different sea level rise scenarios, you can see that's probably or potentially already happening. We are working on phase 2 of this report, so we have all of this bulleted information, which is somewhat cumbersome to read right now. But just imagine a big fancy chart right here that's interactive, that has curves on it, that's color-coded. That's where we're going with this information. It'll still be the same data, same information, but just in something a little bit more easy to read. So let's say, okay, I've got my report. I've got my quick assessment report. I can add that to my big site-wide report. And so now I've got all the information from the understand section and the assess section. And then let's say you were finished at this point, you could print that and off you go. You can also print the assessment and download a methods PDF for how we did this. The analyze section then provides really a detailed methodology on how to then incorporate potential future water levels into stormwater management and into stormwater engineering and infrastructure. There is a ton of information on this page, and we break it down into kind of a basic, intermediate, and advanced analysis. So we kind of show you what can I get at different levels of analysis. What kind of inputs do I need? What kind of outputs do I get? And as you scroll through this page, you'll see different infographics and different graphics that explain what you're looking at. We talk through choosing a scenario. Then we talk through a methodology. Here's kind of a flow chart of that methodology, and then getting into the different steps of that methodology and how to incorporate them. You can see that we prompt you again for, what have you learned from this section? And then we provide different scenarios and case studies. So we actually ran through this methodology in Charleston, but have also seen other communities run through the methodology. So let's say you've done that, or you just want to know, how can I really get started in evaluating potential impacts to my stormwater infrastructure? And in the Take Action section, that's where you're going to find information on different action areas. So planning, regulations, standards, and guidance, on-the-ground measures, and funding. And then we also provide case studies of communities that have gone through and actually have achieved getting, let's say, additional funding to address certain issues. So if I go to this section, you can talk about, different links, different types of information that help you address, gathering additional funding to help you address potential future impacts. And again, we're asking you to document what you've learned. And then here are those case studies for kind of one in the Northeast, one in the Southeast, and then one on the West Coast. Again, we're in version 2 of this website right now, so over the next several months, you'll see some changes to the site. This has typical traditional navigation in it. And that's pretty much it for this tool. And I did want to also kind of give an overview of, we didn't do it at the front end, but in case you're wondering, what is the NOAA Office for Coastal Management? We are a national office, but with a regional and local approach. Just coast.noaa.gov is our main homepage. We have 4 primary programs. We have Coastal Zone Management, Coral Reef Conservation. We have the Digital Coast, which is the resources we just demoed are part of the Digital Coast. And then we also have the National Estuarine Research Reserves. And all 4 of these programs or areas are out of our office. Again, we're located in Charleston, South Carolina, yet we have regional offices. And on the West Coast, we have kind of our West Coast regional headquarters is in Oakland, but there are also a couple of other staff up and down the coast. So some of you might be familiar with that Oakland office. And we are actually, again, like I said, in this Digital Coast section or part of our office. We sit underneath the National Ocean Service also, if anybody is wondering. But that's kind of a quick overview of our office. And we can, I think now we're going to turn it back over for any kind of Q&A.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Billy, and thank you to all our presenters. At this time, if you're on the line and you have not submitted a question yet, please go ahead and add that to the GoToMeeting site, and we'll be reading the questions off. The first question we have is actually for all 3 presenters. How have each of these tools worked in real life communities, and have there been feedback or success stories from users? Are there examples of projects that land managers have used with each of these tools?
Do you want to start, Billy?
Yes. So this is Billy, and the stormwater tool or training. It's pretty new. It's about a year old at this point, and we have held a series of workshops after we rolled out the tool with a variety of communities around the country, and have seen them kind of take and use parts of that site for different planning activities. A lot of the feedback we're getting is that, when it comes to kind of an advanced analysis of evaluating stormwater infrastructure, you're really talking about hiring a consultant. So, right now we're kind of adjusting the information we have on the website to account for that, really your normal, stormwater management office, unless it's a very big office, isn't necessarily going to have the in-house expertise to implement some of the methodology. So we're really trying to work with kind of those pilot communities that we met with, but also incorporate feedback into the site.
This is David, and kind of along the model that Billy was outlining, whereas our resource is kind of a screening level tool. The Coastal Flood Exposure Mapper is very much like that as well. And as an example, here in Charleston, they were doing a detailed flood study, and so the Coastal Flood Exposure Mapper was used as a screening level tool just to pinpoint some areas of concern, and then from that point, once they identified some areas of concern, they moved into a more detailed engineering level analysis with the contractor. Other examples of how the tool has been used, we've heard from floodplain managers that have actually used that tool to either communicate or educate some of their constituents, and as well as heard people who have had to use that as a reference tool in some of their permitting work. So just a few quick examples.
Yeah, and this is Mark. I think for OceanReports, we're probably closer to where Billy is. We released this tool in end of April last year. And we did a lot of workshops leading up to the development of the tool to just feel out whether it would eventually be useful to our typical state CZM clientele. Got a lot of positive feedback there, but we're really at this point looking for good case studies, and the questions that have been asked are, how would I use this? And how would I apply it, appropriately, not take it too far. So we're looking for those case studies. Two areas where I think we've got some potential is informing the NEPA process at the outset of a NEPA set of discussions. And there was interest in terms of NOAA's Office of Education as just a general get to know your ocean space and all the things that are going on. So we're probably going to pursue that and see where we go with that. But yeah, early in the curve on that front.
And just a note too, any of the tools that are on the Digital Coast, so I'm kind of hijacking David's page here, but if you scroll down, you can see related stories. So these are really case studies, or kind of quick little articles on how either the tool itself or the data from the tool was used in a very specific location. So you can actually, for any of the tools on Digital Coast, go in and see, okay, where have people used this information previously?
That's awesome to see. We have a follow-up question for the Coastal Flood Exposure Mapper tool. Somebody asked, how do you see the Coastal Flood Exposure Tool Mapper tool being used in the habitat restoration field? Can you explain a bit more about what the wetland potential layer is?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the ecosystem section is definitely an area where we see that we have room to grow. It's where we can, put a little bit more information out there about, taking action. But specifically, that layer that's being questioned, the Wetland Potential Index layer, that's a relatively new addition. It's created by our land cover team here, and it's also kind of a composite data set. It's created from using soil characteristics data, elevation data, some imagery, also some National Wetland Inventory data. All that is to classify the land areas by the likelihood to be wetland, so or the ability of that area to support wetland habitat. And that particular layer is kind of grading areas that are not currently mapped as wetland or mapped as development upon their suitability for being wetlands. And so that is kind of our first step towards maybe taking action with some some changes within the environment to harness some ecosystem services. And so the point there is that you could look at that layer within your area of interest, look for the areas that have the highest suitability of wetland potential, and those might, especially when you combine it with other layers, looking at maybe protected areas or looking at your parcels data set and trying to identify areas that might be targets for conservation and then wetland restoration or rehabilitation.
Okay, and it doesn't seem like we have any more questions. Presenters, do you have any last minute comments or shout outs on the NOAA side of things?
You know, I would just encourage all the listeners today to explore these tools, and we, all three of us, and OCM in general, are very interested in hearing where people might be applying any of these tools, and if there's ideas you'd like to bounce among the team to maybe do some demonstrations, we're very interested in working with you to do that.
Yeah, and if any of the listeners have any questions that you think about after this presentation, go ahead and send it to us, and we'll make sure to get it distributed to the right people. With that, we'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today and sharing their expertise on all of these really exciting tools and trainings, and we were excited to see how it is used in real life. And so we'd like to also thank the attendees for joining us today. We'll follow up with a recording of today's presentation later on. Enjoy your Tuesday. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the chance to present.
No worries. Bye-bye.